I want to read something that Tom Daschle and Trent Lott published in October, actually, in the Washington Post. They were the Senate leaders, Democrat and Republican Senate leaders, for the Bill Clinton impeachment trial. And there was not a moment of procedural disagreement between them. They co-wrote this piece saying, while we were committed to do impartial justice, as our impeachment trial oath required, we had very different perspectives on key questions, as did our caucuses. And indeed, those differences remained throughout the trial and the final vote. But from the outset of our negotiations, we both understood how vitally important it was to rise above those differences in order to conduct a trial that would inspire the confidence of the public and withstand the unsparing scrutiny of history. And the one personal note I would add to that, Professor Tribe, at the time, since I worked in the Senate in the 90s with all of these people, that is what everyone in the Senate expected both of them to do. There wasn't anyone in the Senate arguing that, no, we should be fighting this out even the procedural agreement should be fought out in a partisan way.
You know, those were the days. It seems to me that even though there were a lot of people who hated Bill Clinton, and there have been a lot of people who hate every president, at least then we were living on the same planet. At least then, even the people who supported Clinton and didn't want to see a trial that would besmirch his name and risk removing him, people like Tom Daschle, thought that the country was important. The Constitution was important. It was important to take our oath seriously. Nobody in those days would have dreamed of saying, I'm not going to be impartial. I don't care that I'm swearing an oath to be impartial. Now, you know, we're not naive. We realize that people have points of view. But if any Democrat were to say, I'm not going to listen to the evidence, even if it exonerates the president, I'd be the first to be attacking that Democrat. And there are some Democrats who have said, my mind is made up. That's not right. Nobody's mind should be completely made up. The evidence is strong, but there might be exonerating evidence. After all, Mulvaney might, though I doubt it, might have some explanation of why the money was held up, that it really was not to put pressure on Zelensky in order to announce that he was going to investigate Biden. If there is such evidence, let them bring it forward. If there is not such evidence, then we got to remove this guy. He's dangerous.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.